Rookie out of Baylor, number 2 in that beautiful seafoam green jersey. Committing the foul, Sophie Cunningham.
One moment, one image, one decision that cracked the league's sense of control. Sophie Cunningham didn't just enter an arena that night. She stepped onto a pressure point the WNBA didn't realize was already splitting. She knew the cameras were locked in. She knew the clip would outrun any statement the league could release. And she understood exactly what that meant. So when a red and white shirt flooded timelines across the country, the question was never why she wore it. The real question was why it landed with force. Contact comes hard as bodies collide, no hesitation, no apology. A hard foul, undeniable. Because what happens when authority tries to quiet a player and the public amplifies her instead?
Great to see her as J.C. Sheldon goes right after Sophie Cunningham. It was a hard foul, no question.
What happens when discipline backfires and a fine becomes fuel, turning into hundreds of thousands of dollars overnight? This is not about merch, shock, or viral luck. It is a live power struggle unfolding in front of everyone. And the most uncomfortable truth for the WNBA is not what Sophie Cunningham said out loud. It is what the moment revealed. We need to rewind to the night the tension finally surfaced in plain sight. A regular season matchup against the Connecticut Sun that looked ordinary on paper, but quietly carried the weight of everything the league had been refusing to address. Sophie Cunningham was doing what she had always done. Coming off the bench. Bringing energy. Picking up full court. Taking contact. Doing the work that rarely makes highlight packages but changes games in ways box scores never show. She was not the focal point of the broadcast. She wasn't the headline. And that made what happened next impossible to ignore. Midway through the game, Cunningham absorbed a blow directly to the head. Clear contact. No ambiguity. The kind of collision that stops play in every professional league in the world. The referees had a direct line of sight. The arena reacted. The cameras caught it cleanly from multiple angles. And somehow, nothing happened. No whistle. No stoppage. No review. The game simply moved on, as if player safety was optional depending on who was on the floor. That moment alone would have been enough to frustrate any player. But it didn't stop there. Minutes later, Cunningham found herself grabbed around the neck in open play. Not incidental contact. Not a tangle of arms. A clear, deliberate grab that forced her off balance. Another play that demanded intervention. Another moment that required officials to step in and protect the athlete on the court. Again, nothing. Silence. The referees allowed play to continue as if the rulebook had vanished. Cunningham responded the only way she could in that moment. She kept playing. She knocked down a 3. She competed. She stayed locked in. But the damage was already done. Not physically, but psychologically. 2 dangerous plays ignored in the span of minutes sends a message. It tells a player that their safety is negotiable. That enforcement is selective. That some bodies are more protected than others. After the final buzzer, Cunningham and Caitlin Clark approached the officiating crew. Not yelling. Not gesturing. Not creating a scene. They tried to have a conversation. What followed was captured on video and spread instantly across social media. One referee repeatedly turned away. Avoided eye contact. Physically disengaged. Sophie tapped his arm, attempting to speak. He refused to acknowledge her. Not once. Not even briefly. Anyone familiar with professional basketball understands how abnormal that is. Players and referees communicate constantly. Disagreements happen. Emotions run high. But basic professional respect is non-negotiable. This wasn't a heated exchange. It was a dismissal. 2 players raising concerns about dangerous contact were treated as if they were invisible. For Cunningham, that was the breaking point. She had taken the hits. She had watched officials ignore obvious fouls. She had tried to address it professionally and been brushed aside. And unlike many players who choose silence out of fear of fines or retaliation, She decided she was finished absorbing it quietly. She opened TikTok. The video was not polished. There was no PR language. No careful phrasing. She said exactly what fans had been saying for years. That the officiating was slow. That it was inconsistent. That it failed to protect players. She did not mention Caitlin Clark. She did not frame it as a personal grievance. She spoke broadly, honestly, and without hesitation. The response was immediate. Views climbed into the hundreds of thousands within minutes. By the end of the day, the video had crossed 1 million. The comments section exploded. Fans flooded in with validation, sharing clips, screenshots, and years of frustration. A professional player had finally confirmed what audiences believed they were seeing with their own eyes. Sports media took notice. Segments aired. Headlines followed. What began as a short social media clip became a full-blown public relations issue for the league. And instead of pausing to reflect, instead of acknowledging the concern, the WNBA chose punishment, a $5,000 fine. The move followed a familiar pattern. Silence the source. Deter future criticism. Reinforce authority. But the league failed to account for one crucial detail. The audience had already chosen a side. And Sophie Cunningham was not interested in backing down. She laughed at the fine. Publicly. Not dismissively, but genuinely. The absurdity of being punished for addressing safety concerns was impossible to ignore. And rather than retreat, she escalated. Not with anger. With strategy. Her next appearance said everything. Walking into the arena wearing a shirt that read, "Hot girls eat Arby's," Cunningham turned discipline into spectacle. The image spread faster than any league statement ever could. The timing was perfect. The contrast was undeniable. A league attempting to reassert control, and a player responding with humor, defiance, and precision. Social media erupted. Fans labeled her iconic. Brands paid attention. Arby's joined the conversation immediately, embracing the moment rather than shying away from it. What followed wasn't accidental. It was a masterclass in reclaiming narrative power. By the time the numbers surfaced, the damage to the league's authority was already done. Hundreds of thousands of shirts sold. Millions in revenue generated. And not a single dollar flowed back to the organization that tried to fine her into silence. Sophie Cunningham had demonstrated something the league could not undo. Players no longer needed permission to build influence. And once that realization entered the public consciousness, there was no putting it back. The aftermath moved faster than anyone inside league offices anticipated. What began as a response to a fine quickly evolved into something far more destabilizing. Sophie Cunningham's social media following surged almost overnight. Accounts that had hovered quietly for years suddenly gained hundreds of thousands of new eyes. Fans weren't just watching highlights anymore. They were watching her. And that distinction mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Within days, Cunningham's TikTok following jumped from a few 100,000 to well over 1 million. That kind of growth doesn't come from scheduled posts or brand consultants. It comes from resonance. From timing. From someone saying the right thing at the exact moment an audience is ready to hear it. She had become a conduit for frustration that had been building long before her video ever went live. The league watched it happen in real time. Every new clip, every repost, every trending hashtag reinforced the same uncomfortable truth. Sophie Cunningham was no longer just part of the product. She was becoming a platform independent of it. And that shift exposed a vulnerability the WNBA had never fully prepared for. Then came the numbers that changed the conversation entirely. Jersey sales reports began circulating internally before they ever reached the public. And what they showed was staggering. Sophie Cunningham's jersey sales had surpassed Caitlin Clark's. Not for a week. Not in a niche market. Broadly. Consistently. Across multiple regions, that statistic landed like a shockwave. Caitlin Clark wasn't just another star. She was the engine driving record television ratings. She was selling out arenas. She was the reason casual fans were tuning in for the first time. By every traditional metric, she should have been untouchable at the top. And yet, a role player known for defense and intensity had outsold her. The explanation wasn't basketball. It was narrative. Cunningham had stepped into a role that statistics couldn't capture. To many fans, she wasn't just a teammate. She was a shield. An enforcer. The one willing to take contact, speak up, and absorb consequences so others wouldn't have to. Whether that perception was entirely fair didn't matter. What mattered was that it felt true. The connection to Caitlin Clark amplified everything. Cunningham's criticism of officiating was interpreted as protection, as advocacy, as someone standing up not only for herself, but for the league's most visible star. Fans who had watched Clark absorb physical defense without calls now saw Cunningham's voice as an extension of their own frustration. That narrative spread faster than facts ever could. And once it took hold, it became self-sustaining. Every clip of hard contact, every missed call, every moment of perceived indifference from officials fed into the same storyline. Sophie Cunningham wasn't just reacting. She was representing something larger. Then the story took another turn. One no one could have predicted. Jeannie Buss entered the conversation. The owner of the Los Angeles Lakers. A figure synonymous with legacy, power, and cultural relevance in professional sports. Her interest wasn't subtle. She publicly offered Cunningham a role in WOW, Women of Wrestling. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't about basketball anymore. It was about presence, persona, marketability beyond the court. Buss saw what others were beginning to understand. Sophie Cunningham had created a character people wanted to follow. Not a caricature. A real person, unfiltered and unapologetic. The wrestling offer symbolized something profound. It confirmed that Cunningham's value was no longer confined to box scores or rotations. She had crossed into a space where identity mattered more than role. Where voice mattered more than minutes played. And that kind of crossover potential carries weight far beyond a single league. Endorsement conversations followed quickly. Brands that had previously ignored women's basketball players began reaching out. Not quietly. Directly. Cunningham wasn't chasing them. They were chasing her. The $5,000 fine became almost comical in hindsight, dwarfed by the opportunities unfolding around her. Even players who had been positioned as rivals acknowledged the moment. Angel Reese reposted the Arby's content with a simple fire emoji. No statement. No explanation. Just recognition. Solidarity without words. It sent a message the league could not control. The attempt to isolate Cunningham had failed completely. Instead of silencing dissent, it had unified it. Players saw what was possible. Fans saw what was rewarded. And sponsors saw value where they had never looked before. Inside league offices, the response shifted from discipline to damage control. Discussions reportedly began around restricting branded apparel, tightening rules, reasserting authority. The instinct was familiar. When control slips, tighten the grip. But the environment had changed. And the tools that once worked no longer did. While executives debated policy, Cunningham leaned further into the moment. She posted photos wearing a gold chain engraved with 5K Fine Club. She posed with Arby's bags. She smiled. Every post reinforced the same message. The punishment had failed. Public support had rendered it meaningless. Rumors surfaced of a national advertising deal. $2 million. For a player earning a fraction of that in salary. The math didn't add up under the old model. And that was precisely the point. The economics of women's sports were shifting in public view. What made the situation so destabilizing was that Cunningham hadn't broken rules. She hadn't staged a protest. She hadn't threatened the league. She had simply spoken honestly and allowed the audience to respond. And in doing so, she exposed how fragile institutional control becomes when fans choose authenticity over compliance. The league could no longer pretend this was an isolated incident. It was a signal. One that couldn't be fined away or ignored. And the consequences were only beginning to surface. By the time the league recognized what was happening, the moment had already slipped beyond its reach. Sophie Cunningham was no longer reacting to events. She was shaping them. Every attempt to reassert authority only confirmed the perception that the system itself felt threatened. And for the first time, that realization was happening publicly, in real time, with no way to quietly course-correct behind closed doors. The truth the WNBA struggled to confront was simple. This wasn't about a shirt. It wasn't about a TikTok video. And it wasn't even about officiating alone. It was about years of accumulated frustration finally finding a visible outlet. Cunningham didn't manufacture outrage. She became the focal point for something that already existed beneath the surface. For seasons, fans had questioned inconsistencies. Players had voiced concerns privately. Moments of dangerous contact were clipped, shared, debated, and then forgotten. The league's approach relied on the belief that attention would move on. That silence would eventually return. But social media changed the rhythm entirely. Attention no longer dissipated. It compounded. Cunningham's decision to speak openly shattered a long-standing assumption that players needed the league more than the league needed them. Her rise exposed how outdated that idea had become. Audiences weren't following logos. They were following people. And once fans aligned themselves emotionally with an athlete, institutional discipline lost its bite. Inside locker rooms across the league, the message landed clearly. Speaking out no longer meant professional exile. It meant opportunity, visibility, leverage. The fear that had kept many players quiet for years suddenly looked misplaced. Cunningham hadn't been pushed out. She had been elevated. That shift forced an uncomfortable question. If one player could create this much momentum without league approval, what happens when others follow? What happens when stars with even larger platforms decide silence is optional? The precedent had been set, and it couldn't be undone. Attempts to reframe the situation fell flat. League statements sounded cautious, defensive, detached. Each response seemed to miss the core issue entirely. Fans weren't asking for punishment. They weren't demanding control. They were demanding accountability. And the gap between those positions grew wider with every passing day. Meanwhile, Cunningham continued operating freely. She didn't issue manifestos. She didn't escalate rhetorically. She simply existed unapologetically in the spotlight. That restraint made her even more effective. The absence of desperation contrasted sharply with the league's visible discomfort. The power imbalance had reversed. The organization found itself responding to her, not the other way around. And in modern sports culture, response is concession. Whoever reacts is already behind. What made the situation so destabilizing was its ordinariness. Cunningham wasn't a generational superstar rewriting record books. She wasn't chasing history. She wasn't protected by untouchable status. She was a rotational player who decided her voice mattered. And the audience agreed. That reality forced a reckoning. If influence could be built without institutional blessing, the traditional hierarchy collapsed. The league could enforce rules. It could levy fines. But it couldn't dictate relevance. And relevance, not regulation, determines cultural power. Sponsors understood this instinctively. They didn't wait for permission. They followed attention. The same way fans always have. Cunningham's authenticity translated into trust, and trust translated into engagement. Metrics confirmed it. Algorithms amplified it. And suddenly, a single player commanded more interest than carefully planned league campaigns. The consequences stretched beyond one story. Young players watching from college programs took notes. Veterans nearing the end of their careers reconsidered silence. The ecosystem began to shift subtly but permanently. The idea that control flowed only one direction no longer held. The WNBA now faced a choice it could no longer avoid. Adapt to an environment where athletes speak directly to fans, or continue enforcing a model designed for a different era. One path required humility. The other promised continued conflict. And every signal suggested which direction the league instinctively preferred. Cunningham never asked to lead that change. She didn't position herself as a revolutionary. But moments don't require permission to redefine systems. They simply expose weaknesses. And once exposed, those weaknesses demand response. The Arby's moment became symbolic because it was effortless. Humor disarmed authority. Visibility neutralized discipline. And the league's inability to counter it revealed how much leverage had already shifted. What lingered wasn't outrage. It was clarity. Fans understood something fundamental had changed. That players could now speak, profit, and grow independently. That institutional silence was no longer effective. That authenticity had market value beyond compliance. This wasn't the end of a controversy. It was the beginning of a new dynamic. One where athletes no longer waited for validation. Where leagues competed with the very individuals they once controlled. Where influence flowed toward whoever commanded attention. Honestly, Sophie Cunningham didn't cross a line. She revealed it. And once that line became visible, it lost its power. Because boundaries only work when everyone agrees they exist. The real question facing women's basketball isn't whether this moment should have happened. It's whether the league can evolve quickly enough to keep up with the reality it exposed. Because the next player who speaks out won't be a surprise. They'll be inevitable, and when that happens, the response will determine everything. The balance of power is no longer theoretical, and the WNBA has now been forced to see it in real time. Control does not disappear with outrage. It erodes when compliance stops delivering results. What was meant to be a small fine, a quiet correction, instead pulled back the curtain on something far more unsettling. A league confronting the reality that its players are no longer waiting to be told when to speak. Behind closed doors, this was never viewed as mirth or humor. It was interpreted as a signal. Because once a single athlete proves authority can be challenged publicly and still rewarded, silence stops being the default. The real question ahead is not whether Sophie Cunningham went too far. It is whether that boundary was ever real to begin with. If players now understand their voice can outweigh punishment, what happens the next time discipline is deployed? This moment did not resolve tension. It revealed it. And what comes next may determine where power truly lives in women's basketball, when the spotlight shifts again for everyone.